So this is a new series that I've started here on my channel entitled A Little Bit of History Repeating. This was highly requested, and it's going to be kind of a walk through the eras, the 1920s through probably the 1960s and 70s, talking about beauty trends and fashion through the decades. So this video right now, this part one video, will be focusing on the 1920s and what was popular in the cosmetic industry and the beauty industry in the 1920s. And then the next video will be a tutorial on how to achieve this look. This 1920s more elaborate, extravagant look is far more popular in costumes and things like that than the more wearable, everyday look that the 1920s woman wore. So we'll talk about that, but the tutorial will be for more of a cinematic representation of the decade. Okay, so the cosmetic industry in the 1920s boomed. It was huge. There was equivocally probably it grew to be about $1 billion industry. And the reason for this was because women were pleasing themselves instead of the male population for the first time. They were embracing independence and feminism, and they wanted to make a name for themselves, and they wanted to stand out. The younger generation wanted to show that they were no longer under the control of their parents. They wanted to show a little bit more of the independence that they saw on screen. Makeup was applied in public. People wanted to be seen with their makeup, with their compacts out in public, and it was just a symbol. It was a symbol of independence. Makeup application was typically a mess among the younger generation because they didn't have mothers to teach them how. So it was a lifesaver when Elizabeth Arden and Frances Berry and others began to develop guides as well as radio programs that talked about makeup application, because generally the women who tried to apply makeup the way they saw it in the movies just couldn't do it. Skincare became a priority. Even back then in the guides from the 1920s, youth was starting to become more and more focused on as being the ideal. So therefore there were wrinkle reducers and youth creams that were popularized among the mature crowd. And even back then, guides discussed using upward motions to apply those creams because to prevent potential sagging in the skin, which I think is interesting because we still see that today. Pale skin was the trend. People wanted pale skin. So typically face makeup really consisted of powder and of moisturizer and a pale powder. However, by the mid-20s, a tanned look also became popular and started to kind of work its way into the beauty industry. So tanning creams and things started to be developed. Like today, film stars were used to sell cosmetics and not models, which is interesting because we know that in the mid-70s and the 80s, supermodels themselves were hugely popular and nobody really wanted film stars to represent cosmetics. So I think that's interesting that we've kind of come full circle on. Makeup was applied daily, but as I mentioned, it was applied sparingly. Women did not typically try to emulate the look of the makeup on the silver screen because, as I also mentioned, it was becoming quite a mess. So typically a woman would have worn light face powder over moisturizer after rouge. The rouge was cream, so therefore it was typically applied after the moisturizer and before the powder so that it would blend more evenly. The colors were typically a rose or raspberry color. Oranges also became popular, and they were just applied usually with the fingers, usually on this part of the face and not to define the cheekbones. They were usually applied here. Rouge was also used to call attention to a variety of things, including the earlobes, the palms of the hands, the knees. You know, the play Chicago, rouge your knees and pull your stockings down. That was true because it was thought that if you applied rouge anywhere on the body, it automatically drew attention to it, which isn't altogether unwarranted. The lipstick was typically a thin-lipped look. The lips were specifically drawn to look thin, and they didn't want them to look full because it wasn't considered to be as elegant. However, later on, the Max Factor popularized the bee stung application, which was basically 2 fingers to apply here, 1 finger to apply on the bottom, and that also became popular eventually. But most of the decade, a thin lip did remain in fashion. Lipstick colors were deep reds, browns, plums, oranges, things like that. They were usually applied in a stain through the day, and most of the time not applied super bright. A very popular brand was Tangy at this time, and you can look up old ads from Tangy that are very interesting. Eyeshadow was usually to mimic the eye color. It was thought that if you applied eyeshadow in the same color as your eyes, that your eyes would automatically pop and would look more brilliant. So there were blues, grays, turquoise, green, and typically they used a finger. They didn't have brushes back then, so it was typically just using a finger to apply the eyeshadow from the lash line and then blend upwards towards the brow. The eyebrows were straight. Do you see? Straight. Many women shaved their eyebrows off and then drew them back on. Some of them just made sure and colored in the eyebrow so that it would look more straight. And the main purpose of this is that in cinema, whenever a woman wanted to look super dramatic and she did this, you see the way the straight eyebrow lends itself to that. So it was a dramatic and very melodramatic eyebrow. And that was what was popular in the decade. If you look at most of the movie stars, Louise Brooks, for instance, her eyebrows were extremely low and straight across. This eyebrow shape is more similar to Clara Bow. But anyway. Nails had a very interesting polish application in the 20s. Mine are too short to actually demonstrate it, but red polishes were popular, but they usually were not applied to the half moon, which we all are familiar with the half moon manicure, but also the nail polish was typically not applied to the tips of the nail, so it was really just in the middle, a strip of color across the middle of the nail. Josephine Baker made Hollywood glamour attainable for black women, and I think that's very, very definable about the 1920s and something else that lent itself to that extreme independent movement of women, because when she applied her white pencil to the waterline, it really opened up her eyes, and she was just the epitome of glamour for a woman of color. So I think that is a very, very important and pivotal moment to mention in the 1920s, is the influence that Josephine Mascara was in a cake form. It was typically black. It was used to coat both the top and the bottom lashes. The eyes were usually, they wanted the eyes to be rimmed. Hair was not always short in the 1920s. There were women who still kept their long hair, and even in Hollywood there were women that had long hair. Many times the hair was voluminous and so full and full of ringlets. However, to embrace the feminine independence, most women did desire to bob their hair, and it was a very, very important moment for women. So they would bob their hair, they would wave it. If it was not naturally curly, they would wave it. If your hair was naturally and curly, you would use finger waving to harness those waves. Not everyone had finger waves. Clara Bow is rarely seen with finger waves. Most of the time her hair is loose and curly and really, really beautiful that way. So if you are wanting to wear an authentic 1920s look, you most definitely do not have to finger wave. Marcel irons were extremely popular, and they were somewhat attainable, and using the heat to deepen the waves of your hair was considered very, very much in fashion. Most of the photos you find from the 1920s do not showcase a hairstyle because the woman is wearing a cloche hat. It was considered very much a part of fashion, and it was considered a necessity to wear a hat. So therefore, I don't have one, but a cloche hat was very, very common at the time. For evening, there were feathers, beautiful clips. Women like to adorn their hair with some type of a gilded band or something like that. So that was also very popular. But anyway, that's pretty much it. That's all I wanted to discuss right now. I'm going to go ahead and start the tutorial in my second part of this video, and I hope that some of this information was helpful to you. If you have any other questions, I do recommend the books that I have reviewed on my channel: Retro Makeup, Classic Beauty by Gabriela Hernandez, and there are so many other great history books to look at. Don't just trust what you see on the internet. Make sure that you've got some good quality references to look at. And I hope that that was helpful to some of you, and I will talk to you next time.